We should get a sponsorship for that, is what we should.
Sponsored.
All right, so we actually have a pretty packed night tonight. So I'm going to open in prayer. And it's going to be a little quicker because we have a video that's somewhat lengthy, but I think it's worthwhile. And today we're going to go over chapter 14 when we should be, I think, on chapter 11. Reason being, this is the last chapter in the book dealing with atheism. And so far we've been dealing with atheism, theism. We've been talking about the cosmological argument. What that is where did the universe come from? We talked about the teleological argument, and what that is explaining fine-tuning that points to a design, right? We talked about the moral argument because they're objective moral laws that would suppose and presuppose a moral lawgiver, right? And so I wanted to bring one of the last objections in, that is that God is a science stopper. Right, so oftentimes you'll get this. To believe in God is contrary to science. You have to choose for some reason. You have to choose, and that believing in a God actually halts the progress of science. And so I wanted to address that. And so I have a video that we're going to show after prayer here. It's Christopher Hitchens, and he is debating a theist, J. Wesley Richards. And so I want to just see their opening, both of their openings. They got 10 or 15 minutes devoted to the topic is the existence of God and the scientific evidence for intelligent design. Okay, so I want you to kind of see that, and then we'll go into this chapter because it kind of goes together. All right, so let's go ahead and pray first. Lord, God, I thank you for the opportunity to come tonight, be gathered with your people, Lord, and speak about things that matter. Lord, we need to reach the world that is around us, and it's incredibly hostile towards you. And so, Lord, I just ask that you would help us develop skills to be able to effectively speak to people. Lord, I want to continue to lift up those that are in need, and I know that many of the brothers that are here are away from their families, God, and that causes a stress and strain. So I ask that you give them grace and you give them mercy. And a lot of the backgrounds that they come from, God, have severed ties and relationships with their family members and loved ones. And God, I ask that you rebuild those. Lord, we even have men that are here that have expressed, my family member doesn't know you. They need you. And so, God, I know that your eye is ever mindful, Lord. You see us where we are. You see us in our condition, our lost condition. And you want us and our loved ones to be found. So, Lord, I know that you are able. God, I pray that you'd be with those that are ill and struggling, Lord, those in our body that have been sick for a long time, like Rachel Cole and Simona, Lord, thinking of in particular. God, I just ask that you would be with them, strengthen and encourage them. For all those that are getting sick with flu and COVID and things this time of year, be with them, Lord. And I ask, Lord, that you would help us this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. John, if you don't mind, roll in the video. I don't think there's any bad words in this when I watched it. So I think the last time someone said something that wasn't, the English guy said something that, like a mild curse word, and Pastor was right there, and so I didn't even think about that. But when I was listening, I don't think I heard anything that was crazy. So if there is, I apologize. I missed it, but don't be offended at me. I didn't say it.
Mr. Hitchens, you're up first. Thank you for coming. Nice of you to have me, and nice of you, ladies and gentlemen, to come, and nice for Californians to lay on a day that reminds me of my English boyhood, and nice, too, to be in the town, the research institute of which not long ago certified Uri Geller as a authorized practitioner of the paranormal. For all the reputation of Stanford for scientific scrupulousness, there's always a little black hole through which things can, and often I've noticed, do creep. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ben. Incredibly generous and undeserved, if rather terse and ungenerous introduction. I remember thinking I should say this by way of reply, that when we first met on the set of what was then the primitive version of Politically Incorrect, imagine what the primitive version looked like, ladies and gentlemen. I remember thinking, he's a nice guy, but he needs to live at least 2 more lifetimes just to live down his work for Richard Nixon. And, of course, for all that I wish this for him, I couldn't quite picture 2 more lifetimes for him, or I better share this with you now, even 1 more lifetime for anyone else. Now you know roughly where I'm coming from. Now I've shared that with you. Now, to the purpose, I'm not at all in search of consensus today. In fact, very much to the contrary, and I can't imagine how I'm going to be able to use up 14 minutes in demolishing intelligent design, as I decline to call it, since it's a propaganda term for creationism. But I'll see if I can waste 14 minutes on it by saying that for consensus terms, we may begin by agreeing that we are in fact here present, that we are present here as actual, rational, or at any rate partially rational primates, that we are on a real planet and we are in a verifiable solar system. Let's not congratulate ourselves too much on this, but it is an achievement of a kind, and it is something we have in common. We can also agree, I think, the chances of this coincidence, or I'd better say really contingency, are fairly remote. They have this, of course, in common with other much less rare contingencies. Any of us here today are much luckier in the aggregate than would have been any comparably randomly selected group of people born 500 years ago, whose life expectancy would have been perhaps 30, and whose infant mortality rate would have been something ghastly to behold. Or if we were born in today's Congo or Darfur. However, from the observation of exactly precisely the same facts, and the same phenomena, and the same processes, it's always been possible to draw 2 kinds of conclusion, and it always will be possible to draw 2 kinds of conclusion. The first is to say that no great decider exists. There isn't a decider who awarded me the right to live while another baby 2 miles or 2,000 miles away barely lived long enough to cry before dying of diarrhea. I don't credit or blame God for these things occurring. That earthquakes and tycoons probably occur. That's what's called by some a Freudian slit. That earthquakes and hurricanes and typhoons and so forth occur not because of the will of divine punishment or divine judgment or divine verdict, but because we live on a climatically volatile planet with a cooling crust which has quite deep faults in some parts of it, including locally. That would be a better explanation, but it doesn't convince everybody. The laws of nature are never suspended. Albert Einstein said that's the miraculous, the only miraculous thing about them, that they never change, that they're completely regular. And they certainly are not suspended in response to prayer or in response to ritual sacrifices, and so forth. The positions I've just given you are my own positions, my own views. I didn't think them up all by myself, but I agree with them. Against it, you can always take the view that we are here as the result of a plan. That we are the object of a divine design, that somebody cares about us, and that this plan seems to imply an author or a designer. These same differences in approach have more recently begun to reflect themselves in the fields of biology and physics, but they are the same as they always were. Now, the supporters of creationism, and I recommend the reading of Judge John Jones's verdict. Google Judge John Jones and Dover, Pennsylvania, if you want to understand why I say creationism, not intelligent design, his ruling in the Pennsylvania court case on this. The supporters of this creationist movement have to be able to do 4 things to you tonight. Watch and see if they can. They must show first that the cosmos itself can be interpreted in the light of a design, or fine-tuning, as it's sometimes called. They must show second that our own planet's hospitality to life is not an accident, not a contingency, and thus might be serving a purpose larger than itself. These 2 gigantic attainments, if available to them, would only get them as far as the implication of an author or a designer. That's what used to be called the deistic position. To get to the position that they really want to occupy, that is their concealed agenda, if you will, their surreptitious wish, the theistic wish, they'd have to be able to show that this deity was not just a creator or designer, but took an interest in human affairs, wanted to regulate the morality of his creatures, would be responsive to appeals from them, deciding on the matter of rewards and punishments, would care whether you ate pork, would care whether you snipped the end of your dick or your daughter's clitoris, would care what day you took as holy, would care what propitiations you made to him or her. Now that is the end result, and don't lose sight of it. And the stages of initial proof, hard as they are the ones you have to watch out for in the meantime. Now, our vast new knowledge isn't all that decisive in resolving this ancient dispute, but it can be of help. I asked Francis Collins, the leading Christian who did the Genome Project, as you probably know, how long he thought humanity had been on the Earth, and I asked Professor Richard Dawkins how long he thought fully evolved humans had been present. Dawkins thinks it could have been as many as 250,000 years. Collins thinks certainly not less than 100,000. 100,000 is all I need. 100,000 years since we definitely separated ourselves from the Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals. I'm exempting from this those of you who may have been to the new Creation Science Museum in Ohio, where you can see animatronic children playing with animatronic dinosaurs in the same park at the same time. And I'm assuming that I can exempt you from that too, sir. But be aware of what some of the implications of this are. Now, that's to say, if you believe in a divine intervention in our lives, that give it just 100,000 years, for the first 94, 95,000, people are born, they die mainly of their teeth or in childbirth or of microorganisms they don't know exist. Their life expectancy is for the first 50 or 60,000 years plus 25 years. They're killed by animals, they're killed by each other in pointless turf wars, they're killed in typhoons, floods, mudslides and so forth. But gradually they make slow exponential progress. They get to the point of suffering all the time, and heaven watches it with folded arms like this. And then 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, heaven decides we can't let them go on like this. We need an intervention. Probably the best place for it would be in Bronze Age Palestine or Egypt. Probably the best form it could take would be a human sacrifice. That might cheer them up a bit. Now, if you don't believe this, you do not believe in any of the three monotheistic revelations. That's what you have to believe. That's the minimum you must believe in order to believe in any of those aforesaid. And of course, it's not believable, or, shall I put it like this, it only replaces the argument as before. It replaces the argument as it was before we knew about Cro-Magnons, or dinosaurs, or Neanderthals. It argues from design. And if everything was designed, what are we to make of the designer, who sentenced so many generations to barbarism, misery, ignorance, slavery, and early death? In the first place, isn't that rather an incompetent, rather tinkering designer, to say the very least of it? In the second place, isn't it a rather cruel, or at the very best, a highly indifferent one? And we still can't be sure whether this same incompetent and indifferent and cruel person cares whether we go to bed with members of our own gender or not, because there's no way to derive verdicts like this from evidence like that. So the religious still haven't scored the ghost of a point. And that's only to comment on what we know about the last 100,000 or 250,000 years of our own lives. Less than a millisecond of evolutionary or cosmic time. Any study of the process by which it occurred, and we're not, I hope, going to hear that it did not, has to impress us with two further facts that are facts, verifiable, findings, verifiable. The first, 98% of every species that ever appeared on this earth has by now also disappeared from it, become extinct. The second is how very nearly we, as a species, joined that list. Look up, if you will, the scientist at the National Geographic who now makes it pop up your own genome, sequence it all the way back to Africa, find out what your ancestry and ethnic parentage is, avoiding the stupid concepts of race that have oppressed us for so long. According to him, by the time we decided to abandon the environment for which our bodies are still adapted, the African savanna, it's very probable, due to volcanic eruptions blotting out of the sunshine by particulate matter and other terrible occurrences, that we were as a tribe down to less than a few thousand individuals before deciding we better get out of this place. We better move on up and out where it's cooler. It's only a very, very contingent matter that we made it this far. And we did not make it because we were helped. We did it by our own unaided effort, if I can put it like that. And our organs, as you can see, when you examine the appendix, the jawline, the coat of fur that you grow and shed in the womb when you're 3 months old, still adapted, annoyingly for us, as are your knee joints and many other things, to the African savanna that we had the good sense in time to abandon. Now, that's not the worst of it. You've got to now think what's going to happen to the cosmos and our place in it. I've got 2 minutes. I'll make the best use of them I can. In the observable universe, there are 400 billion galaxies. Anyone claiming to know enough about this profusion to infer a plan from it had better be very well informed, and I congratulate anyone who tries. When I say observable, I mean something else that's also contingent. Edwin Hubble a few decades ago made the discovery those galaxies are moving away from each other at a very rapid rate that leaves red light behind it. I don't think anyone any longer denies it. Most scientists thought, operating on usual gravitational principles, that that rate would have to slow down by now. They'd be expanding, yes, but the rate would be slowing. No, it's not. It's expanding. The rate is going up. It's getting faster. It's getting close to doubling. That's only 10 years ago we found that out. That means that galaxies are going to be pulled apart faster than light and going to cause them to drop out of view. That means that the reference points for measuring expansion will go, and will dilute everything we found out about the Big Bang to nothingness. In fact, to put it as the great physicist Lawrence Krauss has put it, it will erase all the signs that the Big Bang ever occurred. In other words, those who say to you, how is there something instead of nothing, have got to explain to you how well designed it is, how predetermined it is, that very soon, in physical time, there will be a great deal of nothingness where once there was something. And that this is part of the plan. That the plan is for nothingness. And in local news, more local news, the Andromeda Galaxy is headed our way directly, collision course, much more local news, just our little suburb of the universe. And it will hit us in 5 billion years, which is to say, in real time, tomorrow. In real time, that's very soon. And that's part of the design. Whose design? What kind of designer? What kind of caprice? What kind of incompetence? What kind of cruelty? What kind of nihilism? What kind of commitment to nothingness? And in the meantime, in the little suburb where we dwell, every other rock in our solar system is inhospitable to life as being too hot or too cold, as is large tract too hot, too cold of our own planet, which is on a climatic and ecological knife edge, as we have good and better and more recent reason to know, and that it is as likely that we'll be able to get out of the way of this and move elsewhere in response to the climate crisis as it is in response to the Andromeda crisis, and that those who try and teach you differently are asking you not to use your intellectual or analytical capacities at all, but to do something very old, very backward, like the Aztecs, like the pre-Galileo, stupefied human beings who didn't know the microorganisms were there, who didn't know about the Big Bang, who didn't know about the red light, and simply to place everything you have on a leap of faith. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, don't do it. You know better. Everybody now knows better. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. By your extended clapping, you're eating up into the next speaker's time. Mr. Richards.
Thank you. It's terrific to be here. I count it a privilege to be here, to be the antagonist today of Mr. Christopher Hitchens. When I agreed to do this, I called a very prominent Christian philosopher, the closest thing to a sort of professional debater on the existence of God there is, a guy named William Lane Craig. And I said, Bill, I'm going to do a debate at Stanford in January with Christopher Hitchens. He said, you maybe have some words of encouragement for me. And he paused. He said, he's the most rhetorically gifted of all the new atheists. This is not a word of encouragement. You've seen rhetorical giftedness here. But we're here to debate a specific subject. What's the subject? The question is atheism versus theism, right? That's the title of the event. Atheism versus theism and the scientific evidence of intelligent design. Now, neither of us expects either a consensus, of course, on this question, but neither of us expects a knockdown, drag-out argument that establishes with mathematical certainty the answer to the question. What I want you to consider here for a few minutes, I've got 12 minutes, I want you to ask the question this way. Let's treat atheism and theism as competing hypotheses, competing attempts to explain the world around us. And consider the things that we know either with absolute certainty or that we know pretty darn certainly. All right? And say which of these things, which of these hypotheses best explains the facts that we take for granted. Atheism or theism. In which place, in which worldview are these things we believe to be true most at home? Now, I'm not a literary scholar or a theorist. I'm a lowly analytic philosopher. And so what I want to do is give you essentially a laundry list of facts that I think clearly are better at home in a theistic understanding of the universe than in an atheistic understanding of the universe. Some of these things are evidences for intelligent design. They're drawn from specific evidence and knowledge and discoveries we've made in the natural sciences in the 21st centuries. Others are things that we know simply from introspection. The first of these, I would call to your attention, is our knowledge and certainty of certain moral truths. Whether you're an atheist or a theist, a Jew, a Christian, or an agnostic, there's just certain things that you know are true about reality. Whatever your sociology professor may have told you, for instance, you know that it's simply wrong to torture little children just for the fun of it. You know that's true. I'm not saying you believe it. I'm not saying you simply believe it as a sort of cultural condition that you're shaped by. I'm saying that you actually know it. You know it with a degree of certainty, at least as certainly as you know that there is an external universe. Mr. Hitchens knows it as well as I do. These are simple moral truths. It doesn't mean there aren't complicated moral truths on which we can ask difficult questions. But there are basic moral truths, odds, that we accept and we recognize. Now the question here is this. It's not whether atheists can adhere to moral truths or that can know them. In fact, the Christian tradition has always been unanimous in saying, as Paul said in the book of Romans, that the Gentiles, although they did not have the law, nevertheless had the law written on their hearts. The question is, of the two competing hypotheses we're considering this evening, atheism and theism, in which one is our knowledge of moral truths most at home? The atheist perspective, atheism is something like the claim that there's no such person as God, that the fundamental reality, the thing from which everything else derives, is something like the material universe. As Carl Sagan put it in his great Cosmos series, the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. That's the fundamental reality. It's an impersonal reality. It doesn't exist for a purpose. It doesn't call us to any particular purpose. The theistic claim is that the fundamental reality is a personal being, a transcendent, eternal personal being of maximal greatness and maximal goodness, which defines and calls everything else into existence, which has purposes and intentions from eternity. Now, this being is, by definition, goodness and love, according to the theistic view. The claim is not that if you're a theist, you recognize moral truths, and if you're an atheist, you don't. The question is whether theism or atheism is a better metaphysical home for the knowledge we all have of moral truths. I would argue that it's clearly the theistic and not the atheistic perspective that most encompasses and accommodates this claim. Now let's turn to some scientific questions. There's a great essay by physicist Eugene Wigner called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. What is discernible from the natural world? But I do think there's enough discernible from the public evidence that is available, from the direct introspection to which we all have access, and the best knowledge we have from the natural world, to conclude that there is something like a God. Observing is this strange sort of discovery that we made, especially in the physical sciences, that nature seems to be structured, at least in part of its aspects, according to mathematical formalities. This assumption that there's a rationality, a rational order that can in some sense be reduced to mathematics is not the sort of thing we had any reason to expect. Nevertheless, in the West, the founders of modern science, who did assume that, people like Kepler and Copernicus and Galileo, they assumed that the natural world was rational, that it made sense, that if they worked hard enough they could discover an underlying pattern, and that our minds could discern that underlying pattern. Now, why did they discover that? Why did they assume it as a statement of faith? They assumed it because they had a theistic worldview. They assumed the natural world was rational, that it was ordered, and that the human mind was constructed such that it could, if it were, discern that order. Now, we know that the natural world is at least in part this way. The question is whether, if you're an atheist, you have any reason to expect this, or whether, if you're a theist, that reality makes more sense. We turn then to cosmology, and Mr. Hitchens has actually already summarized the Big Bang cosmology, the basic idea discovered in the 20th century that the universe had a beginning in the finite past. Several lines of evidence point in this direction. The redshift of the galaxies, as he mentioned, the cosmic background radiation discovered in the 60s, even the distribution of the different kinds of elements that we can observe. All of these point to a beginning of the present order in the finite past. Now imagine this. This wasn't a conspiracy concocted by a bunch of creationists in Kentucky. And in fact, when scientists first looked at Hubble's evidence of the redshift of the galaxies, they realized the implication that if the universe had a beginning, then no longer were we relieved of the question, where did it come from? Because in the 19th century, most scientists assumed the universe was eternal. We didn't have any evidence of the contrary. And yet Edwin Hubble discovered, unbeknownst to himself, evidence that the universe had a beginning, and which actually confirmed a prediction of Einstein's general theory of relativity. Now, why does this matter? I think you know intuitively why it matters. Because anything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. Now, you could always deny that premise if you didn't know if the universe had a beginning. But now we know the universe did begin to exist. And so it forces upon us the question, what is the cause of its existence? Unless you're willing to countenance that something can simply come from nothing, or that the universe bootstrapped itself into existence, then you're faced directly in the science of cosmology with the question of what caused the universe. And you want an adequate explanation, you're going to want a cause that transcends the physical universe and that at least has the capacity to bring it into existence. As Mr. Hitchens mentioned, that simply begins the question. But we discover it in the universe that it not only had a beginning in the finite past, but that it conforms to very specific properties of which are called the fine-tuning problem. Starting in the 1960s, physicists discovered that when you look at the various laws and constants in physics, things like the electromagnetic force, the gravitational force, and the speed of light, it turns out that all these things rest, as it were, on a razor's edge. That if they were slightly different, if gravity were slightly weaker or slightly stronger than it actually is, the universe, or a universe compatible with complex life, would not be so much as possible. Now, we know that a universe with life is much more intrinsically interesting than a universe without life. And so again, it asks the question, if the universe looks fine-tuned for complex life, was it perhaps fine-tuned? But even in a fine-tuned universe like this, you still have a number of local conditions that have to be met to be able to build a single habitable planet. Now, Mr. Hitchens is right that in a very large universe with something like 10 to the 22 stars in the observable universe, it might be that you get just enough chances. Maybe you'll get one habitable planet like the Earth just by chance. Maybe we're the lucky recipients of some grand cosmic lottery. But as Guillermo Gonzalez and I argue in The Privileged Planet, there's actually another set of evidence that we think points to conspiracy rather than mere coincidence. What we've discovered when we've looked at the ingredients that you need to build a habitable planet is that those same conditions that make it possible for life to exist on a planet like the Earth, the kind of planet we have, the kind of atmosphere we have, which is transparent to light, our location in the galaxy, the type of sun we have, the weird coincidence that the sun and the moon match in their shapes and sizes in the sky to produce perfect solar eclipses. Those things were all important prerequisites for scientific discovery itself. So that we discovered that those rare places where life are in the universe are also the best places overall for scientific discovery. Now, this is just what you would expect if the universe itself were designed for discovery. It is not what you would expect if the universe is a blind concatenation of matter, space, time, and energy that exists for no purpose. Now, these are all evidences for design that exist prior to any debate in biology. Because once you have a habitable planet, of course, it's not as simple as just add water. You have to have the origin of life itself. Water is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the existence of life. When you're talking about the origin of life, you're talking about the origin of biological information. The origin of the nanotechnology that we discover in the nanoscopic scale. The software and the hardware that we discover inside cells. That the 19th century scientists like Darwin knew nothing. Darwin assumed that the cellular level, we had nothing but simple homogeneous globules of protoplasm. And yet we discovered in the mid-20th century exquisite nanotechnology that exceeds any technology that humans have yet devised. That's a question that at least suggests design for an answer. Now, I certainly can't establish it here this afternoon. Then we turn to the history of life. And there we enter the controversial question of Darwinism, which unfortunately in the United States we can barely discuss in university settings without coming to blows. But the truth of the matter, and the question of the matter, is this. It's not whether Darwin's theory of evolution explains some things. In fact, the staunchest young Earth creationist openly admits and accepts that natural selection explains many things in the natural and the biological world. Natural selection clearly explains the survival of the fittest. It explains things like the variation in the thickness of beaks in the Galapagos Islands, for instance. The question is whether there are things in biology that are inaccessible to the Darwinian mechanism. Are there things that have to be constructed with all the parts in one time and place in order for their function to exist? Are there things, that is, that natural selection can't reach because there aren't any functional intermediates? That's an empirical question, and it's a question that biochemist Michael Behe opened in his book, Darwin's Black Box. The debate goes on, but Behe argues that there are many structures at the microscopic scale, especially in biochemistry, that are what he called irreducibly complex. And that doesn't mean really, really complicated. What it means is that there are certain structures in biology that have to have all their parts working and in place, the same time and place, in order for them to perform a function. That is, in order for them to provide an organism with a survival advantage. Natural selection doesn't have foresight. It selects for current survival advantage. It can't say, well, if I hold these 5 protein parts and eventually get 35 more, I'll eventually have a bacterial flagellum, or I'll eventually have a blood clotting cascade. Foresight is the exclusive jurisdiction of intelligent agency. And so when we discover structures in biology that suggest foresight and suggest that they are inaccessible to the Darwinian mechanism, we rightly raise the question of design. That's in biology. Now let's again return to introspection, because there are two things that each of us experiences directly, neither of which seems to be at home in an atheistic picture of the world. The first is consciousness. We all experience directly the fact that we are conscious, subjective agents. We experience first-person reality. And yet, if you look at many consistent materialist and atheistic philosophers like Daniel Dennett, they admit that the existence of consciousness in a purely material universe is an incomprehensible mystery. So that Dennett and many other atheistic philosophers finally have concluded that consciousness is an illusion. Now, any worldview that implies or concludes that you don't exist is perhaps a worldview you have a reason to doubt. And then finally, our own direct experience of freedom. We all take freedom for granted. We know what it feels like to act freely, to choose one thing rather than the other. We recognize when we're being coerced. We know when we're committed to an ideal and are able to pursue it against adversity. We experience freedom directly. And yet that freedom, which we know directly, makes very little sense in a materialistic and an atheistic universe. But if we are creatures, agents created ultimately by a supreme agent, then at least we have a metaphysical home for the direct experience of freedom that we have. So I conclude with that by saying, quite to the contrary in Mr. Hitchens' argument, there has never been a time in the history of the human race in which it's better to be a theist. Thank you.
Thing. I have to go back to
This
that.
one is, am I on, John? Turned itself off. I think this one's like an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours. So of course we don't have that kind of time. You're probably thinking it's too much already. But I just wanted to show you that. How many people after Hitchens made his statements were like, whoa, like I don't know what to say to that. The guy is really, or was really gifted. He has since passed away of cancer. But the debate was on the existence of God and the scientific evidence for intelligent design. And this was, of course, the opening for that. But later on in this, Christopher Hitchens asked 2 questions of Jay. The first, do you believe Jesus Christ was born of a virgin? The second, do you believe he was resurrected from the dead? And when Jay affirmed both of those things, Hitchens replied, I rest my case. This is an honest guy who has just made it very clear and plain to you. Science has nothing to do with his beliefs whatsoever. Nothing at all. With that statement, I rest my case, he has nothing to do with science. Nothing at all. What mistake do you think Christopher Hitchens makes? He makes an error there. Any idea? That science doesn't prove Jesus' existence? Okay. Anyone else? Do you see where he's making a mistake? He commits what's considered a non sequitur. It doesn't follow logically what he is saying. What is he assuming in those statements? God and science are incompatible. What else does he assume? Anything that cannot be proven by science is contrary to science, right? Anything which cannot be replicated through the scientific method isn't real. If one believes in something outside of the material realm, that person is not scientific and is therefore irrational. That's his line of reasoning. Is that correct? Of course not. Those are all assumptions on his part, and they're not rooted in reality. They are philosophical in nature. So, did you want to say anything, Dan?
Well, I think also it's kind of an attack on him, like, oh, he's an irrational person. You shouldn't trust his scientific evidence or what he believes is scientific evidence, because in the end he believes that someone could be raised from the dead and someone could be born from things that are just impossible.
Things that are absurd, they're impossible,
Right.
Because we all know that that would be miraculous, and the miraculous cannot happen. So they pre-assume what can and cannot be. It's a circular reasoning to begin with, okay? You know, for many, science is the stick used to beat up on those who believe in the supernatural, okay? Talking about fine-tuning or intelligent design is nothing more than a God of the gaps approach. And for you to understand that, what they say is, when you don't understand something, you can't explain something, but you invoke God to explain it, that's a God of the gaps. That's what they consider to be the God of the gaps fallacy, right? There is this belief that exists that you cannot believe in science and God at the same time, that somehow you must pick one or the other, and that God is the great science stopper. This is what they're going to charge against theists and certainly against Christians, right? But I want to just give an illustration here to kind of bring the point home. First of all, can you believe in God and science at the same time? So you're nodding your heads, of course. And of course, there's many scientists that are Christians or theists, right? Granted, there are more that are agnostic atheists, but there are Christian scientists that add to the field, that are well respected. It's possible to be both.
Yeah, I was going to say, many of the early scientists were just believers that believed that science should reflect God, because if he created the universe, that you're going to find God in science. They weren't looking to see God in another way, not to disprove God, but to seek God through his science, through creation, through the things. It was never a thing meant to try to disprove religion through science.
Right, because they saw a rational being that brought order, they thought they should be able to unlock the secrets because of that, right? So it aided into that, and we'll get to that a little later. But let me ask you, if you wanted to find out how much a chicken weighed, what would you use? A scale, right?
I'd read the sticker.
The sticker.
How much it weighed.
I wouldn't weigh it, I would just read it.
Yeah.
I would trust that someone else weighed it.
Yeah.
Could you weigh a chicken with a yardstick? Well, why not? Oh, so that matters. Using the appropriate thing matters when we're talking about weight. Now, if we wanted to know the dimensions of a chicken, how long or how wide or how high it stood, we could determine that with a yardstick, right? Could we determine that by a scale? No, because it's not made for that. Okay. So there's a type of blunder that materialists fall into when stating that God does not exist because he cannot be proven by natural means. And that is, if science, first of all, what does science measure? Things you can see. What else? Feel. Repeatable. So in other words, natural things. So science can measure natural things. Can it measure things that are supernatural? So then when a scientist says God does not exist because we cannot prove him in a test tube, they're kind of saying chickens don't weigh anything because I can't get the weight with a yardstick. Does that make sense? If you try to measure something outside of its scope, you will find nothing. If I try to weigh a chicken with a yardstick, I will find nothing. But it's not correct to say chickens don't weigh anything. But that's what happens when scientists say, I can't measure God, therefore he does not exist. It's the same blunder. Does that make sense? So we should stick to that, right? Tools are meant to measure one feature and cannot tell you anything else other than the feature that they're made to measure. Science is not capable of ruling out the supernatural. It has no way to measure it. It has nothing to say about it. And therefore, it is a mistake to assume that there is no supernatural simply because you can't measure the supernatural by the natural. Okay? So, Dan, I'd like for us to do a little conversation here, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And I have it highlighted with, you're the good guy this time, and I'm not. So I don't want to be the good guy every time. Yeah, I thought I was the good guy last time. All right, well, he's the good guy this time, too.
All right, shh, don't.
So, Dan, I used to believe in God, but now I believe in science.
Explain that to me. I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Well, I used to believe in all the supernatural kind of stuff, but science has shown me that none of that is real.
Can you help me understand exactly how science has shown you the supernatural can't be real?
Well, sure. So you understand that ancient man used to believe in all kinds of gods and things like that to describe things they couldn't understand, like, for instance, the weather. When it was lightning, it was maybe, Thor striking his hammer or something like that, thunder, the gods were angry, and so on and so forth. But now we know that the real reason for weather, what it is, and it has nothing to do with God. So that's why I don't believe in that anymore.
I agree. There are lots of ways science has cleared up confusion for us, but you're saying something's different, aren't you?
What?
Well, you're saying science has somehow shown that the supernatural world is not real. I'm just asking how science can do that.
I guess I really don't get your point. What are you saying about? What are you talking about?
Well, science studies the physical world, right?
That's right.
Yeah, it studies things you have access through your five senses, correct?
That's correct.
If there are really immaterial things like gods or souls or spirits or miraculous power, would any of those things be physical?
Yeah, no, those would not be physical at all.
Right. So, if they wouldn't be physical, how could science have anything to do about them? How can an empirical way of knowing these things show that non-empirical things don't exist?
I think I need a battery, John. I think it's
Yeah.
It's blinking red at me. It's an angry microphone.
See, that's how we silence the atheists. We just kill their microphone.
You just cut the microphone.
Yeah. Well done, John. Well done. Well played, sir. Well played.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Sorry about that. All right, we're back on. Okay. So science has never really advanced to the point to empirically show that the supernatural events cannot happen. It has been assumed by scientists that the material world is all that there is, but they can't really show you anything else because science can't measure that. So it's impossible. But what we're looking at is a stacked deck when we have atheists that claim that God is the science stopper. And under chapter 14 stack deck is where we're going next, right? What kind of world do we live in? That's the question that we all have to answer. Two choices. It might be purely physical, run entirely by natural laws with no exceptions. That is one option. Or it might be possessed by powers beyond mere physical cause and effect, and in this case, the miraculous is possible. That's another option. Now, obviously, the atheist would reject the second one in favor of the first, and the theist would reject the first in favor of the second. But the critical question to ask is, what world do we live in? Science is mute on the matter. Only philosophy can answer this question. That's key to understand. Because when the atheist brings this objection, their philosophical understanding is what shines forth. Now, I have a quote I'd like to read from 2:13. I think it's pretty good. Let me turn to that. And this is by Richard Lewontin. And he's he's somebody in science that's not Christian. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. We are forced by our a priori adherence to material cause to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And that, I think, is big. It's philosophical in nature. And the deck is stacked. So, intelligent design is called unscientific, not because of its lack of merit. It is dismissed because of its philosophical implications. It's dismissed because it violates the scientist's materialistic philosophy. When the scientists dismiss design, they stack the deck against the supernatural. Their starting point already excludes the supernatural, making no room for its possibility. How do you fight against that? And what they're showing you is not reason. What they're showing you is philosophy for that. So God, the science starter. And what Dan has mentioned before is true. If science were contrary to God, why did it start in Western civilization, Christian Europe? Why? Why did it start by Christians if it was so counterintuitive? See, the philosophy of naturalism was not the driving force for science in the early days. It just wasn't. Theological conviction was the foundation for the start of science. By Charles Darwin's time, the basic methods of science were firmly established. He didn't create that. And it sprouted from Western civilization. The Chinese didn't start it. The Romans didn't start it. The Egyptians did not start it. The Greeks did not start it, although they had all the raw material for a scientific revolution. Why? Why did it happen in Christian Europe? And the reason for that is the Judeo-Christian worldview helped to inspire and shape the founders of modern science. The obvious order of the universe fit the conviction of the original scientific pioneers. They rationed, if God is a God of order, and he is, then everything he does is ordered. And our natural world is ordered by laws and rules, and therefore can be discovered, because God can be discovered. If a rational God fashioned the universe, then rational men made in his image, could unlock its secrets. Now, Kepler, one of who Dan was talking about, was an astronomer in the late 1500s. Boyle was a chemist in the mid-1600s, and Isaac Newton was a physicist in the late 1600s. They were all pioneers in science, the fathers of their areas. They were all Christian. For these men, nature was God's second book of revelation, showing his glory. And they used three main metaphors when describing nature: book, clock, and law. It looks to be ordered. It looks to have laws. It looks to be designed like a clock. And that's how they used to describe nature. The uniformity of order that could be observed was a fingerprint pointing to God in these men's eyes. There was no original hostility between science and God. He was not the science stopper. He was the science starter. And so I just wanted, that's basically all I wanted to go over here from that chapter. Questions? Comments?
Well, I thought it was interesting, both Hitchens and in that quote with that metaphorical foot in the door. Like, even Hitchens was kind of like, yeah, if we allow even the idea of design, like that will give religion too much of a foothold. Like, they don't even want to allow that as an idea because it's such a strong idea that if it's on the table with what they present, that it could easily kick what they're saying. So we're like, that's not even allowed on this table. We're not even going to allow it at the same playing field. It's like saying, tell me what it is that you drive out there, but it can't be a car. You can tell me it's anything else, but I don't believe cars exist. You could tell me it's a four-wheeled motorcycle, or it could be a bicycle with an engine, but it can't be a car. It's like, but even though it's like, yeah, but everything points to it being a car. It can't be a car because I said they don't exist. In my world, they don't exist. It's that kind of thinking.
Yeah, it's somewhat ridiculous. And I like what Jay said in his opening, that neither of them can prove without 100% certainty, either the existence or the not-existence. But what he said is, when you see elements of design, it does beg the question, is there a designer? And that makes sense. And I think in some of the books that he was claiming, like Darwin's Black Box, great book to read,
That's a
by the way.
fantastic book.
His book that he did, I don't remember the name of it, but I haven't read that one. But one of the books that I read is like, if you found a fully operational clock on Mars, what would you assume? Somebody put it there. Would you assume it was some natural process over the eons? Right? Either somebody put it there, right? Or something put it there, but it just didn't happen in and of itself. There's too much design there to deny a designer. And also what he said, I think, was good during Darwin's time when he's talking about the cellular level. Darwin thought they were just globular proteins or whatever. He had no idea of the complexity within that cell. And so the nanomachines, I think, are fantastic, and it's a good way to describe it. We've talked about it before, right? That if you found a computer code, which is a language of 2 zeros and 1s, and you saw that code, none of you would say, well, that was a coincidence that just so happened through time and chance and matter create. And yet we have the human cell that isn't a 2 code, it's a 4-digit code, right? That happens over 3 billion times or million times, an incredible amount of times within each one of our cells. And so that points, is there a designer that does that, like a computer programmer to a computer? And see, the interesting thing is the atheist would say, well, that's a computer programmer. And you'd say, well, what about this? Oh, it's even more complex. It's not design. It just appears to be that way. It doesn't make sense to me. Any other comments?
John Hagee did a thing about this. There was a college study going around all the college campuses that what you believe has a relevance on everything.
does.
And so it freezes whether you believe it or not. The Bible, God is true whether you believe it or not.
Correct. Glenn, did you have your hand up? Did I see you? So, thoughts by science, it's like 13.6 billion, 14 billion years ago was the start of the Big Bang. That set everything in motion. The theory of the Big Bang? Oh no, that was discovered in the 60s, I think they said. Was it 60s?
That's what I was thinking. I'm not 100% sure.
Was it Hubble or was it 20s? Fairly recent, either the 19th century, 20th,
Yeah,
or 20th
20th
century,
century.
21st. Yeah, 20th century. That's when it was discovered. And what Hitchens was talking about was that red light, further evidence of that. Evolution was older than that point. Even before Darwin built upon it, and I don't remember if that was the 1700s, late 1700s, that possibly the idea came about, but Darwin built on that, and his ideas became the popular notion. So I don't know all the exact dates. Right. But before that, I thought it was interesting that they just thought that the universe was eternal. So that's why I don't get why people push against the Big Bang. I'm like, that's proof positive that God created, that the universe isn't infinite, it's finite, and had a starting point. And so then they can't hide behind, oh, it's just eternal. Right? No, you got to explain where it came from. If it's eternal, you don't have to explain it. Right? And so when Christians are like, oh, I don't believe in the Big Bang, I'm like, why? That's proof positive that God acted.
It's like the
Right?
very beginning of the Bible. It's kind of talking about that right there.
I never get that.
Yeah.
Quite. It doesn't make sense to me.
Actually, I find it funny when the atheists bring up the Big Bang. They're like, well, there's the Big Bang. And I'm like, yeah, I have one of those in the Bible. It talks about it right in the beginning.
Right in the
It talks
beginning,
about
in
it.
the beginning,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Robin.
I know you mentioned that science really started with Christians. Do we know, like, what really switched? I don't want to say it's like where it started turning, where it was more using the atheistic mindset of like, oh, if you believe in science, you don't believe in God, kind of thing.
That's a good question. The question was when, okay, so early Christians then, in the start of the scientific method and that sort of thing, were Christians. Where did it turn towards atheism? And I'm not exactly sure, somewhere about 150 years ago, around that. Yeah, after the Enlightenment, certainly by the time of Darwin.
I think Darwin really pushed a lot of
really
that.
pushed that, yeah.
Because it gave them an alternate theory that they can think about and consider.
Right. Does it include God? But again, even if evolution is true, there's still the problem of how do you get the living from that is not? So, fine, you have a Big Bang, you have all these hot gases, and it takes billions of years to solidify, and stars need to form and collapse and get the materials for other things. Okay, whatever, I'll grant you that, right? And so we have this world now that's hospitable, that's ready for life, and like Jay said, you can't just add water and get life. Where did that come from? How did the organic come from the inorganic? That's still a problem for evolution, because evolution's not creative. It's not. Evolution's a process, right? It's almost like the law of gravity, where it has to have something to work upon. If it's not there, it can't work on anything. You see what I'm saying? So that's still a problem for the atheists. They can't explain that. How did we get life, the organic, from the inorganic? It makes no sense. The God hypothesis makes more sense. I say it like that, knowing that it's not a hypothesis, but that's how it would be called. So don't send me hate mail. Go ahead. What's that? I don't get the Big Bang from anywhere. It's like I didn't create that. That's from science, from Hubble's discovery and what he saw in, I think it was the 20s or whatever. And that
Probably
was from-
didn't actually make any noise because
No, it probably didn't make noise because in space there is no, they can't hear you scream. What
Yeah.
movie is that from? Is that Alien?
probably.
I don't know. Again, don't send me hate mail on that one.
Yeah.
Let me get my post-it.
Right. All right. You do have my address, yeah.
The one thing I find interesting about all of this, but they're always like, well, millions of years, this could happen. And they isolate everything to as if it's just, okay, humans could exist. With millions of years, humans could exist.
Time, chance, and matter.
And
yeah.
planets, they could exist. If you had enough time, planets could exist.
Right.
And if you had, this, and this, stars, they could form if you had millions of years. I'm like, but what are the statistical odds that all of those things
Are there?
came to being? Like, statistically, just humans alone is just actually astronomically impossible. Like, statistically,
Yeah.
there's more, the chances, there's more atoms. There's more, it would take more chances than there are atoms in the entire universe. But if you start, they always want to separate it, and I see a lot of Christians when they debate these atheists, because they separate all of their points into little subsections, and they debate one little tiny bit, but they exclude the rest of it, because if you put it all together, it's near impossible.
It is. Well, it would
Yeah,
be impossible.
right? You
I
could
think
take
that's the point.
right,
It is impossible
Right.
without an intelligent designer.
right,
If
Yeah.
you actually look at that, it's impossible.
as a whole. Yeah.
Go ahead.
The first guy said something about
Christopher Hitchens.
design is propaganda.
Yeah. He used the term
Right.
propaganda for intelligent design.
So is he just making a dig, or
Yes.
Yes.
It's a dig. It is, he would say it is creation disguised as science, is how he would describe that, how I've heard it described.
essentially it's the same thing as creation?
Yeah, that's what he'd say. It's the same thing as creation, just a different word packaged a little differently.
He's just trying to say that religion is propaganda.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
So we're talking about evangelism and evangelizing people. So isn't it safe to say that even if we can give answers, and it's good that we can give intelligent answers
Yeah.
to try to open them up, but God says he's caused the foolish things.
To confound the wise. Yes.
So don't we still ultimately, even if we have all the answers, we need God to do a miraculous enlightening of another person's soul
Yes.
in order to see them get converted, not an intellectual wrestling match.
Right. We don't want to have the intellectual wrestling match, so to say, just to wrestle. Like, we're not wanting to just destroy people like you see online or, Facebook or whatever else you would see. It's not about demolishing people, because demolishing people, destroying people doesn't win them to Christ. It just makes them angry and hate you. And so you could have every answer to every question. None of us will. But even if you could, right, that doesn't mean that you're going to win anyone to Christ, because at the end of the day, it's up to the Holy Spirit to open their eyes and to show them. And some people are so blinded and refuse to see that it won't happen. And it's so frustrating. I could tell you this as a counselor. I see people all the time that they hate the way that their life is going, but they're not willing to look at the things they need to do to change. They resist that, will not look at that, will not even accept that they could possibly be the problem. And so they remain in their dysfunction. And it's so very sad, because I can clearly see it. They can't. And it's maddening. But you'll come across people like that, where it's so blatantly obvious, and they will stick to their guns that, no, this is not, no. And you're like, that's not you. And you don't, see, we can't open their eyes. And sometimes I think we give ourselves more credit. Like, if I just tell them this, that's going to, remove the scales from their eyes. And that's not necessarily the case. So again, we don't say, come to them in love every single time we talk about this, but it's already been established, so that's important. We don't say, you got to pray, you got to pray up and make sure the Holy Spirit's working within you. I don't say that every time, but of course that's important, right? I don't say share the gospel every single time, but where you can do that, that's so important, right? All those things are important and part of the process. This is just one little key of it. Because I can tell you this, if you're not knowledgeable on these things, they won't take you seriously. If you just hide away in your Christianese bubble, close the door, hang out with all your Christian friends and talk about how ridiculous the world is, they will die and go to hell. Right? And I don't want to do that. I want to be used in whatever capacity I can be used in that moment. It's not what we're called to do. You know? It's not what we're called to do. And so what is the point of this? It's to build the skills. It's to get the idea so that when you are in real life situations, you can make an impact. That's it. And that God could utilize you because he wants to remove those blinders, scales from their eyes. He does. But some people will refuse up until the end. But we don't know that. We don't know who or who not will. We don't know if there'll be some kind of end of life situation which all of a sudden they're reminded of this and they come. See, the Lord's not willing that any should perish. He's going to do whatever he can to the very end to bring them home. Yeah.
Is there any truth to the testimony that Darwin repented on his deathbed?
I don't know. There is. I don't know if it was his daughter or someone said that he repented, Charles Darwin, on his deathbed. I don't know if that's true or not. I've heard that, and I've heard it was his daughter, I think, but I'm not sure, because some people say that's total bunk. You know, there's no truth to that. So I don't know. Only God knows, I would suppose. Yeah. Other questions? This is good. Glenn. Yeah. It's the problem of evil.
Yes, and to me, I've had similar kind of conversations, not that rough though. And it's very difficult to be patient with somebody when somebody's saying that about God, and I'm like, I want to reach across the table.
I understand. You got to resist the urge to reach across the table, Glenn.
Yeah.
It's tough because, I'm talking about my Lord and Savior, and it's very difficult to get through that.
I understand that.
Yep.
It's very unnerving at times. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, so I noticed that the atheist and the theist, they brought up different points.
Yes, they brought up different points. Well, that's what would happen next.
Yeah.
So they both do their opening statements, and then they get a chance to go back and forth. That's what we didn't see. That's what we didn't have time for. But
Yeah.
it's on YouTube, yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
If this is not your cup of tea up here, what I showed, I don't tell you, I'm a nerd. I love this stuff. So I almost every day look at stuff like this.
There's a lot of really good ones that Christopher Hitchens
Oh,
has debated against. I think he even did John Lennox.
He did
as well.
John Lennox.
John Lennox
I think
is
William Lane Craig.
He is so good. If
They're
you
really
if you
good.
could just look up John Lennox and just watch his
I'm
stuff,
a
it's
fan
so
of Christopher Hitchens. I'll tell you,
Yeah.
that guy is brilliant. Wonderful orator. I could tell you I would be demolished. I would be demolished if I went up against him. I'd probably be a blubbering fool. But he's that good. He's
The
really
the one
good.
thing I would say though is if you can hear him speak and you can see the false things that he's saying,
Yeah, it makes it easier.
he's the best at saying what atheists feel and how they're the best. He's probably one of the best linguists with them.
Oh,
So if you can see what he's saying and see the fallacies in it and see, well, yeah, that's not true. You can see the big lie that's
can hold your
presented.
own, yeah.
Then you could probably be pretty confident that when you're just talking to somebody that's not well versed in philosophy
You'll do
and
much
debating. I mean he's does this for a living, I'm
Right.
sure.
Oh, he did,
lectures
yeah,
and
before he passed.
Yes, before he passed.
One of the things that I love that Jay brought up was the idea of the irreducibly complex.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites.
Darwin's Black Box, wonderful book to read. Get it, read it. You will not regret that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the author, I don't remember his name is Beebe or something like that, he said, oh, it's a guy with a weed whacker. Okay. One of the things that, this is how my brain works. I hear something that's out of the door. I'm like, oh, what happened? Squirrel. Shiny. Okay.
Next few months are going to be fun. You're going to have to make sure all the
So,
blinds are down for you.
He said the irreducibly complex, right? And he doesn't mean that
Yeah.
it's ridiculously complex. He means that anything that is irreducibly complex means it cannot be broken down to simpler forms because it then would cease to exist.
Like a mousetrap.
Like a mousetrap. But what he
Yes.
said, like the human body, he made mention of it, and it's really true. The blood clotting in humanity and animals is absolutely brilliant. And all of the intricate things that are involved in the blood clotting process, you understand this, when you get a hole in your body, inside of your body, a process happens that causes the blood to clot and plug that hole, causing scabs, right? Until that tissue can heal, then it falls off. And so the process is complex. Read about it. It's amazing. Like, oh my gosh, all of these letters, A and B and something, come together with this, and it coagulates and does. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. But what he said is that can't come up from evolution. And the reason being is if you had an animal that got punctured, he would bleed to death. Right? So you would have to have this already established for it to be effective, because there's no other way that just a single part of it could then hope to build on, because you would die and your species would die. And that's not very good for evolution.
And it's even worse that even if it did develop clotting, it has to be able to stop the clotting and know when to stop it, or else all the blood in the entire body would clot and it would die.
So and that Darwin's black box goes over that, and other examples, which is pretty cool.
Doesn't he like it to the, Foghorn Leghorn?
He might have.
I don't know if that
don't
was
remember that part.
Stephen Myers. Well, he talks about it. It might have been him, the other book I read. But if you've watched that cartoon where there's the bowling pin hits the bowling ball that swings on a rope and hits the stick that falls over, and all these little things have to happen. Well, if at any point you were to pull out one of those items from that list,
It doesn't work.
the whole thing fails to function. And that is a lot like what blood clotting is like.
Yeah.
All these little things have to happen for the entire process to work. And yeah, it's really interesting, because amazing how God builds like these things, these anti-evolutionary ideas into things.
Inside of the cells.
Yeah.
That's cool. All right, any other questions before we dismiss? Good stuff. Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily a question.
Okay.
It was just like in the last two videos, like it seemed like their mindset, like it was like how you were saying with the people that you counsel. Like they have an issue, but they kind of don't want to see it. It seemed like
Right.
their take on God, like when you talk, like they debate. That's what they do. So it's like no matter what you tell them, even if you were to give them like information,
Oh, it wouldn't be enough information. Right.
they're not gonna. They don't want to hear it.
Right, they wouldn't believe. In some of these, you'll see, especially in Frank Turek's videos, he said, if this, what do you say, if I can prove this to be true, would you become a Christian? And sometimes they're like, absolutely not.
If Christianity were
If Christianity were true, would you believe?
true. Yeah, and some say no, I
And
wouldn't.
follow God?
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't.
Right.
So,
There is one thing I want
Sure.
that earlier in the book, like we talked about this, but we're really in the gardening business.
yes.
So, like every conversation you have, it's not about swinging the home run. It's really just establishing something that they can chew on. As if they're an atheist and you were to share some of this stuff and just like, well, maybe they never even thought about that there was that it could be designed, like those ideas, because they may have been told that those are just foolish ideas. But if you can give good proof, you give good evidence towards there being intelligent design, later down the road, he might think about that, and then somebody else comes along and gardens and continues gardens, and then they might reap something that you just sown that you don't, a lot of the conversations that Kokolet's had, they're not hugely profound. He's not even thinking that it's going to lead to anything, or a decent, even a conversation sometimes. But just knowing that you're sowing into the kingdom, at least a little bit, and you can pray over that conversation afterwards. You're like, they're not a Christian, and I may never see that person again, but, Lord, I pray that you put another person in his, in his path that can water that seed that I planted. And so I think that's the important thing, is always don't feel like even if you lose the conversation that you're having, you feel like you lost it, it's not really lost, because the Holy Spirit's going to move
Correct.
in ways that or beyond what we can imagine.
And you could take the pressure off, because think about it this way. How many conversations would it take for you to walk away from your faith? It'd be more than one, right? So the person that is an atheist, or the person that doesn't believe in God or all or whatever, it's going to take more than just one 10, 15, 20-minute conversation to get them to walk out of their belief system. First of all, because nobody ever wants to be wrong, right? We hold on to our beliefs so dearly, even when we know we're wrong. Sometimes we won't admit we're wrong. So the idea that you have to get somebody to renounce everything they believe and follow Christ after your one conversation, I think, is naive, right? And so instead, look to make the points where you can, like Dan said, to give them something to think about, put that stone in their shoe, and then allow the Lord to work on them, because they may need to have 20 conversations with someone before they're even ready to consider to turn to God. But that's up to him, not to you, right? Okay, very good. So, yes, ma'am.
I have heard once that a lot of atheists used to be Christians. Is that any truth?
I don't know what the percentage of atheists that used to be Christians, but certainly, yes. I agree with you. There are probably numerous that used to be Christian in some sense, or theist in some sense, and then turned to atheism. And oftentimes you'll hear something very emotional from their life that happened that caused them to go that way. Yeah, I think that's probably true. But I don't know any specific statistics or anything like that. That'd be interesting to look for. All right. I've developed a cough that just is driving me crazy. It's Jeff's brother, Paul. Yeah. All right, guys, you are dismissed. Next week, we're going to do a little different. We're no more atheist talk. We're going to be talking about Jesus the Son. Chapter 11. It will be indeed chapter 11 next week.
You promised last week it was going to be chapter 11.
I want you to call. I was wondering if we'd call.